Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world, with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
No apologies for returning to the Ukraine. After all, it seems, as we predicted last week, to have plunged us into the cold bath of Cold War rhetoric, with the temperature reaching Cuba Missile Crisis depths. Beyond irony or even satire, countries which have themselves slaughtered more than 1 million people over the last few years, invading and occupying country after country, thousands of miles off their shores, denouncing Russian actions which haven't cost a single life on their own doorstep.
Beyond whataboutism, however, the mainstream media, who are eager to find signs of bias in others, hardly gives mention to the ultra-nationalist neo-Nazi parties on the streets of Ukraine and even in some ministries in the new US and EU-backed interim government.
Indeed, if your only news source was Western media, you wouldn't even know that there had been a leaked audio of a phone call between Britain's EU representative Baroness Ashton and the Estonian Foreign Minister, in which the latter suggests very clearly that it was people acting for this very interim government in Kiev who killed the protesters and the police in Maidan in a false flag operation. That the mainstream media doesn't mention it is why Sputnik exists.
And we're orbiting the world to give you the details missed by the mainstream.
And let me make this clear. What you get from the Sputnik is our view of the truth as we see it. And no blow-dried auto-cue speak-your-weight machine should ever persuade you otherwise. Helping us make sense of the week's events on the Eastern Front will be regular RT talking head Alexander Mercouris. But first, Gayatri, with her red gloves and snow on her boots, took to the streets of London to take the temperature out there.
I don't know enough about the situation in Ukraine, but I reckon if we had our fleet, the British fleet, that was on somebody else's sovereign territory, and it looked like that country was in a state of flux and possibly could bring in a government which was pro some other power or against our power bloc, then we might well be considering going in there to protect our interests. So it's all about power politics, and I'm not sure there's entirely a right and wrong. Nobody wants to see a sovereign state actually invaded, and that has happened, so it's wrong.
Do you think it's going to be a big war?
Well, no, I don't think so.
No?
No, Russia is too clever for that,
Yeah?
and too strong. But I'm for Putin.
And why do you think? What do you think about the language then, about from Cameron and Obama about economic sanctions and boycotting Sochi?
Well, why don't anybody else put sanction on the UK and United States when they would commit war crime in Iraq? Well, this is double standard, isn't it?
I don't think anyone should be saber-rattling, and least of all the Russians. So if you produce aggressive behaviour, you're going to produce aggressive behaviour in the alternative. So nobody should be aggressive. Nobody should be let to people to decide through democratic and peaceful processes.
Alexander, let's start with what I think is the biggest story of the week, and many weeks for that matter. I've spent my whole life ridiculing conspiracy theorists. I almost never believe them. Here we have, on the face of it, evidence in this telephone call between the Estonian diplomat and the head of the European Union's Foreign Policy Directorate, Baroness Ashton, in which it is quite calmly discussed that the massacre of 22 police and more than 50 demonstrators on the Maidan may very well have been a carefully staged provocation, organised not by the Yanukovych tyranny, as John Kerry describes it, but by the very people now in power in Kiev. What's your take on that?
Well, if anybody followed the situation in Kiev carefully, they would know that there were some very dangerous people there. Right sector, Mr. Yarosh, who is their leader. And these are very violent, very dangerous people, entirely capable of doing these things. and they have a fascistic, neo-Nazi, in fact, let's call it Nazi ideology. So it is entirely predictable that they would behave in this way. The remarkable thing about that telephone conversation is that these two very senior officials of the European Union, an Estonian foreign minister and the foreign affairs minister, if you like, of the European Commission, calmly discuss this question and then move on to other topics.
Well, actually, if you go to YouTube and watch this very conversation, there's a content warning saying that this may be inappropriate for some users.
Certainly highly inappropriate. To be fair, I thought that Baroness Ashton sounded
Concerned,
shocked, surprised.
Yes.
But she's done nothing about it.
Absolutely nothing.
And this footage has yet to appear on the British state-owned BBC.
Absolutely, and he's been barely reported apparently in the United States, and the only comment the American government can make is to complain about the people who have leaked it.
For the weeks previously, policemen had been set on fire, there had been beatings and so on. There was a lot of rough stuff.
Yes.
But a massacre there had not been.
Yes.
Suddenly there was a massacre and the dogs of war were unleashed. Are you really saying that these thuggish, fascistic paramilitaries have the sophistication to carry out such an operation? Because I'm wondering if it's not someone with a bit more expertise and experience in this kind of thing.
But who knows? At this moment in time, we don't know enough about all of this. It's entirely possible. If we look, for example, at an analogous situation, which is Syria, we see how extraordinarily violent and dangerous people have been used in Syria by some of the same forces, the same powers in the world that are now taking such a great interest in the Ukraine. So it is entirely possible that people who did this sort of thing in Syria could do this thing in the Ukraine as well. I want to just come back to this point you were making. The real crisis in the Ukraine is not in the Crimea, it is in Kiev. That is where the epicenter of this is. That is where a coup took place using extraordinary violence. Lots of people were killed. Up to now, in the Crimea, no one has been killed at all.
The Crimean Parliament has voted unanimously to join Russia.
Yes.
A referendum is being arranged. What happens, though, in eastern Ukraine, where 47% of the people are either ethnic Russians or Russian speakers?
Yes.
And where the kind of political forces on the streets in Kiev are not particularly to their taste.
No, they're not. And this is really, I think, the slow burn fuse. If you look at an awful lot of the Western commentary, not the really loud rhetoric, but the undercurrent that goes beneath, it is the eastern Ukraine that they're really frightened of. Because if that blows, or if the Russians intervene there, which they've said they would do if their people were actually threatened, then, frankly, the West faces an extraordinary crisis and conceivably humiliation as well.
Well,
now,
Simon Jenkins, the veteran and rather right-wing commentator, was making the point in the newspapers this week that the principal weapon at the disposal of pipsqueaks like William Hague and David Cameron would be to stop Russian oligarchs coming to buy stuff in Harrods.
Yeah.
I myself could live with that.
Well, I think Mr. Putin would be very pleased, actually. If you actually look at what he was talking about over the last couple of years, it's actually about relocating Russian wealth back to Russia. If we're talking about economic sanctions, well, there might be some. The chances are probably they will be token, but we'll have to see today. Whatever happens, they have to talk to Russia. Russia is too big. It's too important in this world not to talk to. So we will see an awful lot of noise. The Crimea, I think, is lost to the Ukraine. I think everybody knows that. They don't want to say it publicly, but that's the real situation. And now the whole game, if you like, is to try and hold what's left of the Ukraine together. And they realise that they need the Russians' help to do that.
Yes, but the people they've appointed, I mean, they've appointed two oligarchs worth $10 billion between them to be the governors of these two great parts of the eastern region. And they have put into the intelligence ministry, the defense ministry, the prime minister. Deputy prime minister is a fascist, an outright fascist with a swastika on his sleeve. that can't possibly play with Russia. It wouldn't play in the West if the West actually reported it.
Yes.
If it were seen on our TV, the Deputy Prime Minister of the new Ukraine with his swastika on his arm, it wouldn't play here. That's why we don't see it, isn't it?
Absolutely, which is precisely why all this is being stopped. People don't talk about it. They talk about completely other things, about the fact that it was a democratic revolution and all the rest. And they don't talk about the foreign ministry, the Estonian foreign minister and Caroline Ashton's conversation either, because it goes completely against the narrative. But to come back to your point, it's absolutely clear that the present regime in Kiev, I don't call it a government, I call it a regime, it's self-appointed, is not acceptable to the Russians. They've made that absolutely clear up to now. What the West has to do to sort that problem out, I don't know. It's going to try, I think.
Well, we're going to throw money, no?
Well, they're meeting now for a EU summit on Ukraine.
And huge sums of money which have miraculously appeared from nowhere, which weren't available for member states like Greece.
Well, indeed.
Are suddenly apparently available for Ukraine.
Well, apparently, because in fact, when you unpeel it, it's not clear how much money actually is on the table. Mr. Kerry went to Kiev, and all he could offer was $1 billion in loan guarantees. That's not money, that's actually loan guarantees. The simple fact is that Ukraine is bankrupt. It's running out of money fast. Its gas reserves are extremely low. And on the 1st of April, the gas discount, which the Russians granted, is going away. This is a major problem for the Europeans. And if they're going to get the Russians and the Ukrainians talking to each other, which is what the Europeans are saying, then they're going to have to do something about who is running the shop in Kiev.
Alexander Mercouris, thanks. I'm not sure if we'll do Ukraine next week, as we have the last three, but we might have to. Coming up after the break, former British Labour Cabinet Minister Brian Wilson on why the breakup of this particular small country would be a bad idea. Don't miss it. Welcome back to Sputnik. My next guest has been a personal friend of mine for fully 40 years, notwithstanding some pretty serious political disagreements along the way. But one thing we do agree about is that breaking up a small English-speaking country come September would not be in the interests of working people on either side of any new border between Scotland and England. He and I are about to set off on tour. It's like the Rolling Stones getting back together, complete with tour bus, but no sex, no drugs, no rock and roll. Asking the Scottish people to just say no to separatism. But before we do, Gayatri asked the people of London what they thought of the idea of Scotland leaving them.
When it comes to Scottish independence, I wouldn't mind at all. I mean, I think it's really up to them in terms of their decisions and their aspirations in relation to decisions that they're going to be making.
No, I don't think Scotland should leave the UK. They're part of the United Kingdom.
I'd prefer them to stay with the UK. I think they'd be foolish to go.
No, I don't reckon they should leave, no. They're very important to the English culture as well,
Can you imagine why so many Scots, a third, it's quite a lot, that they would wish to leave the UK?
National pride. That's not, it's purely simple, national pride. Any country wants national pride. That's one of the problems that England doesn't have, because of political correctness of national pride, because it's classed as incorrect to be patriotic.
They want to be independent, they're crazy. They'll go broke.
Mother's pride you can eat, national pride I don't think you can eat. We'll come back to that point. None of these people on the streets of London have got a vote in this. Do you think, first of all, that the basis of this referendum is correct, is fair? I mean, why should the 800,000 Scottish people who have to work in London and the rest of England not have a say in this?
I think that's the least of the problems, really. You have to draw a line somewhere of who can vote, and people registered to vote in Scotland. If you accept the premise that Scotland has a right to decide as opposed to the UK as a whole making a decision in this, then I think you have to take the people who are registered to vote in Scotland as the electorate. The electorate.
Now, the polls are a little bit volatile. They show a lead for the no side. What's your reading of the trajectory of Scottish public opinion?
If you look at this historically for the last 30, 40 years, you know, it hasn't changed very much. There's always 30-odd%. I mean, I think that the first question to ask, is this the question people in Scotland are most interested in being asked? Because Scottish politics for so long now has been focused on this constitutional issue, and the question are being asked, it's almost inevitable you're going to get a, you know, that kind of proportion of people who, when there's only are two answers available, but you're going to get that kind of division on the constitution. How much of that 30% are actually preoccupied with it? However, how many people would say it's our number one priority to, you know, to put a border across our small island? That's another question. But if you ask for a yes, no on that question, then I think, you know, it doesn't surprise me it comes out at 30-odd% saying yes. And it is volatile. That I suppose the dream scenario for the Nationalists is that come September it would look likely there was going to be another Tory government, and then they would present it not as a Scotland versus the Union thing, but Scotland versus the Tories. And you know, there is a market for that to appeal to as well, and that is why it's very important to make not just a constitutional argument or this or an economic argument, but actually to make a solidarity argument about the shared interests of people in Scotland and England.
Is it all about, as that lad outside the shop said, just national pride?
It's something to do with national pride. It's something to do with identity. But you know, I think that the danger is when identity becomes what motivates your politics, and you've lost sight of much bigger issues, and particularly the dangers of losing shared interests, which people in Glasgow or Edinburgh have exactly the same interests as people in London or in Liverpool or Newcastle. And probably with the breakdown of the organised labour movement, with, you know, that there's less of that kind of feeling of solidarity, and therefore unless you keep making the arguments, then the danger is something else fills the vacuum. And for so long now, this has been going on, as we both know, for decades. But if you've got somebody who's constantly telling people who are poor or disadvantaged in Scotland that the reason for this is not the economic system and the balance of forces within the UK as a whole, but it is a sort of Scotland-England divide, it's a Westminster-Scotland divide. If everything is painted in these terms, then of course there's going to be some kind of market for that. So you always have to have someone telling the counter story that actually the people with more poverty within a 20-mile radius of Westminster than there is probably in the whole of Scotland. It's the shared issues, the shared problems, and all you would end up with in this is not one right-wing government, you'd end up with two right-wing governments.
Right. I mean, Scotland won't be free of the Tories, will it, if it becomes independent? It will be forever under the Tories, because the Tories will rule at Westminster, and they'll control the currency that the Independence Party wants to continue to use.
See, I've always thought it was a dangerous line of argument saying there's no Tories in Scotland. I've lived in Scotland all my life. Of course there's Tories in Scotland. But what has happened is, as the Tories became a more discredited brand in Scotland, then more and more of that vote found refuge somewhere else. And nationalism, up to a certain point, is a very convenient place to find it. I mean, the heartlands of nationalism are not, you know, among the working classes of Glasgow or Lanarkshire. The heartlands are Angus and Perth and the northeast of Scotland,
Banff and
Buchan, the traditional Tory strongholds in Scotland, and that's where the Tory vote has crumbled, and that's where the strength came from. And the trick of nationalism, wherever it arises, is essentially to be a chameleon. It will be whatever people want it to be in any given place at any given time. So if you think you've got the kind of the sort of reactionary heartlands showing up, then you turn the rhetoric towards the other parts of Scotland who want to hear more different messages, social democratic messages. We can be more left-wing, we can be more progressive in Scotland than we can in the UK as a whole. But then you go back, you know, which is what we must do more of just now, is say, well, there's no need to look in the crystal ball, read the book and see what they're doing in Scotland. They have the power to make a social change. They have the power to be redistributionists in Scotland at present under devolution, and none of that is happening. And we have a centre-right government in Scotland, a Tory government in Westminster, and we would carry on. There is absolutely no a priori reason to think that an independent Scotland would be any more progressive than a devolved Scotland is at the present time.
Brian, I think I agree with you that identity plays a big role in the current debate in Scotland, and that the whole obsession about the Scottish identity, the whole Braveheart play, misses the actual points, and that you're right that they might be even worse off without out of the UK. Yeah. Do you think that it's a small group, however, that is leading this identity campaign, or is it widespread throughout Scotland?
Well, I think identity's strong in Scotland. I feel Scottish. Of course, I feel Scottish, but I don't. It doesn't dominate my thinking. I mean, I live in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. I feel a much greater affinity for that part of Scotland than I do for Scotland per se. I think most of us carry multiple identities, and we don't find any difficulty in having multiple identities. The pernicious thing about nationalism is it makes you choose between identities. So the vast majority of people in Scotland are very comfortable being Scottish, being British, being Dundonian, being European, being Hebridean, being whatever you may be. But the thing that nationalism does is try to turn you against one of these identities and to make you choose where there is no need for a choice to be made, because until someone presents that to you, then you can quite happily accommodate not just dual but multiple.
It's a false dichotomy. The Braveheart, Mel Gibson was an Australian making a Hollywood movie about a war between two French-speaking kings with Scottish people fighting on both sides. I said recently, I mean it, you may not agree, you're actually rather more of a Scottish figure than me. I'm not remotely interested in 1314.
No, I'm not.
I'm only interested in 2014 and beyond. Yeah. But it's not, Gayatri, a small group. As someone active on social media, I can tell you, there are thousands and thousands of these people buzzing around like hornets, ready to sting anyone with
but they're running this campaign, yeah?
Yeah, but the accusation is that you're not Scottish if you are against independence, that you're a Tory if you are against independence. This is going to poison the well for a long time to come, Brian.
Yeah, I think the well is poisoned. I think that the saddest thing, I'm now looking back over a lifetime almost, that the sadness is that the radicalism of Scottish politics has been dissipated really on this pointless debate. That now all... if you look what's going on in Scotland just now, there has been regression on the attack on child poverty, which did actually, a lot of progress was made in the Labour years. You see local authority budgets being cut and the services that poor people depend on. But all of that is subordinated now to this constitutional debate. And the entirely false narrative that all you have to do is to change the constitution and all of these social issues somehow disappear. Whereas, as I say, there's not a shred of evidence of that from what is actually happening in Scotland at the present time. But ultimately, it probably is the economy that will decide it. And the more people realise that, we have had 300 years to become an integrated economy. There are many success stories in Scotland, but to a large extent they are success stories because we are part of the bigger UK economy. We have tens of thousands of jobs in financial services in Edinburgh, but we only have that because we're part of the same entity as the one we're sitting in just now. So the more the economic reality strikes home, then yeah, I do think that independence will be defeated. But I also agree with you, the well will be further poisoned because we're having the wrong debate and the wrong issues, and it is going to leave inevitably a sense of. Well, I don't know, disappointment would be the least of it, I think.
People can catch us on tour, Just Say No. You can follow me on social media or go to Just Say No website for details of that. Brian Wilson, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Now it's your turn to tell us what you think in the social media review and roundup. Gayatri, what's rattling?
Well, you recall John Kerry saying that in the 21st century, you just don't behave in a 19th century fashion by invading another country on completely trumped-up pretext. Claire Robb responds to that, "Oh, Mr. Kerry, you should really think before you open your mouth pot calling kettle black."
The point that she's making is the point of the week, isn't it? That John Kerry, and for that matter, William Hague and David Cameron, seemed to have no trace of irony in their voices. as they thundered about a bloodless intervention permitted by treaty
It's himself,
between
yeah.
Russia and the Ukraine, and backed unanimously by the Crimean Parliament, and likely backed in a mass referendum. They keep talking about the need for democracy in Ukraine, when it's the democratic government that was overthrown by street power and violence.
On Scotland, Helen says that, well, let them go, I say. See how long it takes them to come crawling back. They will need us before we need them.
No, that's entirely the wrong attitude. And that's likely to assist the separatist forces. We need each other. We're better off with each other.
Well, that's it for this week then.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can keep in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook you can find us on Sputnik on Russia Today. That's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.